New York City is known around the world for being a welcoming place for people from all walks of life, but it was not always this way. That's because in the vicinity of the courts, City Hall, and several federal buildings on the edge of Chinatown and Tribeca rests an unfortunate secret. And while that secret became one of the most important archaeological finds in U.S. history, it's one that revealed the prominent and not as widely discussed role that a certain unfortunate institution played in the beginning and evolution of New York City. Oh yes, there is history here. Before we dive in, don't forget to like this video and hit the subscribe button so that you never miss an episode. Both are free to do and go a long way toward helping us continue exploring the little-known stories that shaped our world, including the story of how a federal building construction project in Lower Manhattan uncovered one of the most significant archaeological finds in U.S. history. During the Clinton administration in the 1990s, the General Services Administration, or GSA, moved forward with construction on a new federal building at 290 Broadway, known today as the Ted Weiss Federal Building. As is standard practice with federally funded projects, the General Services Administration sent an archaeological salvage and consulting team to ensure that nothing of historical significance would be disturbed during the building process. But during the survey, the team stumbled upon something unexpected: a random group of human bones buried 30 feet below street level on Broadway. But when they dug deeper into the situation, they realized they were not the only ones. In fact, they ended up finding the remains of 419 individuals. It did not take long for the government to discover what was beneath the footprint of the federal building: a small portion of the oldest and largest known excavated burial ground for enslaved and freed Africans in North America. In a little more than 6-acre area, roughly bounded by Broadway, Foley Square, Duane Street, and Chambers Street, between 15,000 and 20,000 free and enslaved African adults, children, and infants were believed to be buried. But this discovery begs the obvious question: why is this massive burial ground in New York City of all places, not far from icons of freedom such as the Statue of Liberty? Wasn't slavery more of an issue in the South? Sadly, the African burial ground serves as a reminder of the major role New York City played as a slave hub in colonial America. It's a story that stretches back to the city's roots as New Amsterdam in the 1600s. At this time, the Dutch were in charge, windmills dotted the landscape, and as Assistant Professor Andrea C. Mosterman in the Museum for the City of New York notes, slavery played a key role in the city's economy from the start. Records show that enslaved Africans were in New Amsterdam as early as 1626, with slaves consisting a substantial portion of the city's population. Their labor, furnished by the Dutch West India Company, played a critical role behind the Dutch city's development. Where did the slaves come from? Mostly from parts of the Americas and Africa, but Central Africa was perhaps the most common source. And if one was not clear where a particular slave came from, they didn't have to look far. In fact, the Dutch often named their slaves after the countries they came from. The first recorded marriage in a New Amsterdam church between two slaves, for example, occurred in 1641 between Anthony van Angola and Lucy d'Angola, both of whom, of course, were from Angola. And these slaves in New York, who sometimes worked as part of chain gangs, literally built up New Amsterdam with their hands. They constructed the city's fortifications, harvested the settlers' crops uptown, and built the city's roads and infrastructure. They were also a common sight at the city's docks and helped artisans with their work. They even built the wall that Wall Street is named after. And of course, they were also tasked with taking care of highly distasteful jobs. At one point in 1664, city authorities ordered the slaves to clear the city streets of dead hogs, and they even put their bodies and health on the line to protect New Amsterdam from Native American attacks. But even in the midst of these conditions, these slaves had more rights and liberties under Dutch rule. Not only could they earn wages and own property, but they were also reportedly protected from whipping and other forms of arbitrary physical punishment. They also had the right to file court actions and petitions to address their grievances, and some even successfully sued free Dutch colonists for damages for unpaid labor and harming livestock. Additionally, they even had the opportunity to petition the West India Company for conditional freedom, also known as half-freedom. If slaves were granted conditional freedom, they would receive their own plots of land to raise their families, usually in areas to the north of the central New Amsterdam settlement. And while they were expected to pay a nominal annual fee to the company and remain available for work, which is why they were not considered fully free, these individuals received wages for the work they performed. However, The picture changed for Africans in New Amsterdam once the British took over the colony and renamed it in honor of the future King James II, who was, at the time, the Duke of York. And James, according to historian and author Christopher Moore, had an unsettling side business. That's because he served as the principal investor in the Royal African Company, a prominent slave trading group. So yes, even New Amsterdam's new name honored a prominent slave trade figure, and it was a sign of things to come. Unsurprisingly, 8 conditionally free slaves asked New Netherlands' colonial council to grant them full freedom status. That's because with the change of power to Britain, there were fears that the British would not acknowledge their conditionally free status and re-enslave them. But while this fear would not become reality for those individuals, who would later settle in what is now Washington Square Park as the city's first free African-American community, most enslaved Africans in the newly renamed New York City would not enjoy the same fate. The British ended up reversing many of the protections the Dutch had in place for the city's enslaved population, which consisted about 40% of New Amsterdam citizens at the time of the seizure. This included reinstituting physical punishment and subjecting slaves to sunset curfews and restrictions on unsupervised gatherings above 3 people. And even those Africans who were granted conditional freedom still faced curbs on their liberties, including punishments for even hosting slaves at their households. The British continued importing slaves into New York City, bringing in approximately 6,800 to 7,400 between 1700 and 1774, mainly putting them to work as dockhands, ship construction workers, and even ferry captains. And by 1775, New York City hosted the second largest slave population of enslaved Africans in the colonies, outranked only by Charleston, South Carolina. And not long after the British arrived, they established a new church, one that has been at the receiving end of much attention and blame regarding why the African burial ground came to be. That church, Trinity Church, was initially planned out in 1696, and its third and current church building stands to this day in the financial district. But while you can find the graves of people like Alexander Hamilton and steamboat inventor Robert Fulton in this downtown graveyard today, you would be hard-pressed to find any belonging to free or enslaved Africans. In fact, New York City adopted a policy of mortuary apartheid, barring enslaved Africans from being buried within the city's limits. Some claim the chief reason falls on Trinity Church and its decision to bar Africans from being interred in their burial grounds, but it's an assertion that today's parish states is misleading. After reviewing church records from the period, the parish's historian reported in a 2004 article about the African burial ground that the parish had used what she described as a more nuanced policy when addressing the burials of enslaved Africans. As she noted, while the church did adopt policies restricting the burial of enslaved Africans, the segregation it practiced was fluid. In other words, it was not evenly enforced across the board. And to top things off, the church even established a policy to permit burials of the enslaved if they were communicants, namely, if they were baptized and entitled to receive communion during church services. And in 1773, Trinity Church even designated a dedicated plot for burying Africans in the church's farmlands to the north of New York City's limits. The church said this area was located a few blocks west from the African burial ground. And although the church implemented subsequent policies and bans, parish meeting notes from the time suggest they came about after slave owners ignored the parish's earlier instructions to use the alternate burial ground. But regardless of the situation, many of those enslaved still needed a place to conduct their burial rituals and inter those who passed away, an issue that plagued free and enslaved Africans alike, even during Dutch rule. At first, these likely burial spots were at the farms where they toiled away, or at New York City's first public cemetery in Bowling Green, which had been in use between 1649 and 1673. But in addition to Trinity's parallel plot, there was another tract of land that New York City's Africans began using to bury their dead and practice their sacred traditions. Research from the GSA and Howard University note that a chaplain named John Sharp mentioned Africans being buried in the Common, which was an open area north of the city limits that hosted livestock and some public gatherings. However, he was actually referencing burials at the African burial ground just nearby. In truth, the actual site was on land deeded to Cornelius Van Borsum on behalf of his wife Sarah, particularly to recognize Sarah's work as a translator in helping maintain relations between Dutch settlers and Native Americans. There's no evidence explaining why Africans were allowed to use the Van Boursenplatz both through and after Sarah's death in 1693. But once her heirs began squabbling with city officials over the land after her death, in a dispute lasting until the late 1700s, it became difficult for New York City's Africans to continue their burial rituals. Not only was cattle grazing and other agrarian activity common in the common next door, but the not-so-lenient English began using the immediate area for public events and executions, and even built the city's first almshouse with its own cemetery area. And as New York City outgrew its upper limits, the burial process only got even more cumbersome, especially since the slaves did not hold title to the grounds. The British, for example, buried deceased prisoners of war in the southern part of the sites, and owners of surrounding land started deeding out parcels for tanneries, breweries, and other business establishments. And in 1745, the city actually constructed a new defensive wall that ended up bisecting the burial ground. And given the site's proximity at the time to Columbia College, which hosted the city's only medical school, students and professors would allegedly visit the grounds illegally to exhume bodies for use as cadavers, especially during the winter months when bodies decomposed at a slower rate. It's said that anger over the practice at the burial ground precipitated the 1788 Doctors' Riot, which is estimated to have claimed the lives of up to 20 people. Eventually, burials in the 6.6-acre land stopped around 1795, and the grounds were leveled and subdivided into residential homes. And because the burial ground was in a ravine, planners also raised the ground elevation to facilitate home construction. But this choice also had a deeper consequence. Namely, by allowing the remaining graves underneath to remain undisturbed for centuries, given that as much as 25 feet to 30 feet of fill separated the bodies from the basement floors of these houses. And if you're having a hard time visualizing how deep this would look, today's monument actually pays homage to this little factoid, which we'll get into shortly. While some maps marked out the burial ground, referencing it using a derogatory name we won't repeat here, it was largely forgotten over time. And even though some landowners found human remains on their property while doing home projects or construction, it did not occur to them to investigate deeper. For example, the July 25, 1897 edition of the New York Tribune referenced that numerous human remains were discovered at the old Gemmell House by Duane Street and Broadway as they were tearing it down to construct a skyscraper. However, the reporter and even the house's original owner did not attribute it to the burial ground. The owner initially thought the bodies had belonged to a potter's field, while the reporter said they were likely tied to an incident in 1744 when 13 Africans were burned at the stake and 18 hanged. Over the ensuing years, the houses that stood on the burial ground and the businesses in the surrounding area gave way to the city's town hall, state courts, and even federal buildings, and the burial ground's existence became a faint memory. That is, until the discovery of the 419 bodies at 290 Broadway. The exhumed remains, which were buried individually with their heads facing west, as per tradition among New York's African populace, made their way to Washington, D.C.'s Howard University, where they underwent further testing and examination from 1991 to 2003. Of the 419 bodies that authorities uncovered, 130 belonged to those aged 15 and under, including 51 who were 12 or less months old. The National Park Service believes many more infants were buried there, given how their soft bones would have disintegrated into the soil. But even though most slaves who survived past the age of 2 would live on into adulthood, they still did not live long lives by today's standards, which speaks to their poor quality of life at the time. Most adults in the cemetery are believed to have passed between the ages of 30 and 45, with women dying at much younger ages. By contrast, the European men and women buried in Trinity's churchyard were 10 times more likely to live to an old age than the slaves they held. According to the National Park Service, 30.5% of those buried in Trinity passed away at age 55 or older, compared to only 8.2% of those in the burial ground. Even today, thousands still remained buried underneath the buildings constructed over the burial ground, after successful protests from the African American community and preservationists convinced Congress to halt further construction on the federal building's planned pavilion portion and set aside space for a memorial. And on February 27, 2006, President George W. Bush proclaimed the African burial ground as a national monument, making it New York City's youngest. And efforts have been underway since 2007 to establish a full-fledged museum. You can find this monument today on the corner of Duane and Elk Streets, which, along with the visitor center and its exhibits around the block, are free to visit and open to the public. In the monument itself, which occupies only a small portion of the original burial ground, is chock full of symbolism. The first part, The Circle of the Diaspora addresses the African diaspora, which was the forced removal of Africans from their homelands to foreign locations, including New York. It is a circular walkway that submerges down into an interior court, showing not only cultural images from the areas the diaspora touched upon, but also information about some of the individuals whose bodies were recovered. And if you look up, you'll find the Ancestral Chamber, a 24-foot high structure that symbolizes the strength of the African spirit, and is designed to resemble the types of ship's holds that held slaves in transit. And the chamber's height is not 24 feet by coincidence. This height is meant to symbolize the distance below ground, where the 419 bodies were discovered. As for the remains that were already uncovered, they were transported back to New York City from Howard University in a 6-day event that included celebrations in Philadelphia, Newark, Wilmington, and Baltimore. When they arrived in the Big Apple, they were transported by boat to a port in Lower Manhattan, symbolizing where these individuals likely would have first arrived during their lifetimes. Each of the 419 remains were placed in individual hand-carved coffins made in Ghana and grouped into 7 larger crypts, with all of their heads facing west as they were found. And to cap off this 6-day rites of ancestral return ceremony, which featured an appearance from Maya Angelou and other figures, each of the 7 crypts were respectfully lowered into the ground on the memorial site. When you come to the memorial, you can find these 7 burial mounds where you can pay your respects to these individuals, and, with the permits, offer libations. Even though the site is approximately 15,000 square feet, the African Burial Mound National Monument casts a much larger shadow on New York City, given its significance to the city's history. One that stands in ironic contrast to the courts of justice and federal buildings that sit on or surround the original burial ground's 6.6 acres. But while the monument is a step in the right direction toward honoring the free and enslaved Africans who helped set the foundation for today's New York City, it also serves as a stark reminder of the long road ahead for racial equality efforts even today, and the past wounds American society is still reckoning with. It just goes to show how even infamous history can be right underneath your feet. Thanks for watching There Is History Here. If you enjoyed diving into the past with us, make sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button so that you never miss an episode. Both are free to do and mean a lot for helping us grow our channel and reach more people. Your support helps us continue exploring the stories that shaped our world and the unique history that's right under our noses.